Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus, your free supplemental guide to the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video, we're going to read and analyze William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 1. This video is part of our Shakespeare unit. The first video published in our Shakespeare unit was actually Introduction to William Shakespeare's Sonnets, and I do encourage you to please watch that video first before you delve deeper into any of the individual sonnets. In this video, the first thing we're going to do is read Sonnet No. 1. Then, in an effort to better understand the poem, we'll discuss its archaic and obscure language, and then we'll follow that up with a simplified, plain modern English articulation of the poem. After that, we'll discuss the Sonnet Tie. We'll also discuss the poetics of the work, and then we'll conclude with a review and some comprehension questions concerning the poem. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. That would really help us grow the channel and produce more free English language arts content for you. Thank you in advance. Okay, so we have a few rules for reading poetry here at ELA+. These rules are detailed in the video How to Read a Poem. I'm going to link to that video down in the description, and for those of you who have not yet watched the video, please do so. For those of you who have already watched the video, you know that rule number 1 is read the poem. I'm assuming that you've already done that on your own, which brings us to rule number 2. Rule number 2 is you must read the poem aloud. Let's go ahead and do that together right now. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. But as the riper should by time decease, his tender air might bear his memory. But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies, thyself thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel. Thou that art now the world's fresh ornament, and only arrow to the gaudy spring, within thine own bud buryest thy content, and tender churl makest waste and niggarding. Pity the world, or else this glutton be, to eat the world's due, by the grave and thee. So now that we've read the poem, what we want to do next is understand the poem. Now, with poetry in general and Shakespeare in particular, this can be quite difficult for some people, actually for most people. With Shakespeare, the difficulty arises from the fact that Shakespeare was writing over 400 years ago, so a lot of the words that he uses we no longer use. There are actually 2 such archaic or obscure words in Sonnet No. 1. Let's take a closer look at those 2 words. The first archaic word appears in line 12, and that word is churl. Churl can mean either a rude, ill-bred person or a miser, someone who is both stingy and morose at the same time. Now I think that as we continue to discuss Sonnet No. 1, you're going to find that both definitions apply here. The second archaic word is niggard, and it also appears in line 12. Now, right off the bat, I gotta say that this word is not at all related to the awful racial epithet you probably thought of when either you read it in the poem or heard me say it right now. Niggard is not a racist word. A niggard is someone who is stingy or meanly covetous. So in that respect, it's related to the word churl. And now that we've cleared up the definitions of the archaic language of the poem, we can now move on to articulating a plain modern English restatement of the poem. In order to do that, it's best to understand first, who are the characters in this sonnet? Now, Sonnet No. 1 has 2 characters, the speaker and the young man. Now, for a more in-depth analysis of the characters of William Shakespeare's sonnets, please see our video Introduction to Shakespeare's Sonnets. But for now, all you need to know is that the speaker is the person in this poem who is speaking, and the young man is who the speaker is speaking to. Here's what the speaker is saying to the young man. Quatrain 1. We want to procreate with other beautiful people so that our own youthful beauty never dies, and it can be preserved for future generations. Quatrain 2. But you, too much in love with your own beauty to settle down and procreate, are quickly burning yourself out. Quatrain 3. Yes, right now you are beautiful, but soon that beauty will pass, so please don't keep it selfishly to yourself. Concluding couplet. Do the world a favor and reproduce your beauty through procreation. If you don't, you're only going to be remembered as a selfish person who kept all his beauty to himself and left none behind for anyone else to enjoy. Okay, so that's the basic thrust, procreative pun intended, of Sonnet No. 1. The speaker identifies a lovely young man. He tells that lovely young man that he should find an equally lovely young woman. Those two should get together, make some babies, and pass on that beauty to future generations. And now that we have a basic, plain English understanding of the poem, we can start to think about how it fits into the collection as a whole. Now, for those of you who have already watched our Introduction to William Shakespeare's Sonnets know, Shakespeare's sonnets can be divided into two broad categories. 1, the young man sonnets, and 2, the dark lady sonnets. Obviously, sonnet number 1 is part of the young man sonnets, but there are further subdivisions of the young man sonnets, and the first 17 are called the procreation sonnets. That's right, William Shakespeare dedicates 17 whole sonnets to the act of procreation. This is some horny stuff he's getting into. And we'll get into all that, I promise. But first, let's talk about this sonnet's couplet tie. If you want to know more about Shakespearean couplet ties and what they mean and the purpose that they serve, please see our Introduction to William Shakespeare's Sonnets. In a nutshell, though, the couplet tie is an idea developed by Helen Vindler in her book, The Art of Shakespeare's Sonnets. According to Vindler, the couplet tie are the words or variants of words that appear in the 3 quatrains of the sonnet, that's lines 1 through 12, and also the couplet, lines 13 and 14. Paying attention to the couplet tie will often clue you in on what the major theme is of the sonnet as a whole. I've highlighted in green this sonnet's couplet tie, and that couplet tie is the word world. Now, what do you think Shakespeare was getting at here when he made this word, world, the couplet tie? Let me know down in the comments below. And now that we've identified the couplet tie, reviewed a plain English meaning of the poem, discussed its archaic words, and read the poem, we're now ready to dig deeper into the poem. Let's get to it. To begin with, we can say that of all the 154 poems in the collection, sonnet number 1 is probably the best to kick things off because it introduces a lot of the major themes that we're going to find as we travel through all the rest of the poems. I'm talking about the themes of time, immortality, beauty, selfishness, and yes, procreation. You could say, to bring in the couplet tie, that sonnet number 1 encompasses the entire world of Shakespeare's sonnets. It's for this reason that Heather Vindler writes, "Such a wide sweep leads me to think that the sonnet may have been deliberately composed late, as a preface to the others. The sonnet can be seen, in some, as an index to the rest of the sonnets. Even the format of the poem informs its themes, and that the poem conforms perfectly to the rhetorical format of the English or Shakespearean sonnet. This is to say that the poem has a thesis that is developed through every single quatrain, each one with its own self-contained idea, and then it's all wrapped up beautifully with a concluding couplet. Let's take a look at this process more in depth. The first quatrain states a moral imperative: beauty demands procreation. The second quatrain informs the young man that he is in violation of this moral law by failing to procreate. In the third quatrain, the speaker tells the young man that time will take his beauty from him if he doesn't stop being so selfish. Finally, the couplet pleads the case that the young man must help the world by procreating before both he and his beauty are extinguished forever. Beyond the thematic concerns of the poem, Shakespeare is hard at work artfully employing those foundational elements of poetry: metaphor, and of course, this is Shakespeare, puns. Now, metaphor, for those of you who don't know, is a figure of speech wherein a word or a phrase is applied to an object or an action that is not literally applicable. The first metaphor we encounter in sonnet number 1 is beauty's rose. The speaker isn't referencing a real rose, a literal rose. What he's doing is drawing a likeness between the beauty of a rose and the beauty of the young man. Now, there are at least 3 interesting things about this metaphor of beauty's rose. First, beauty's rose represents a man. The sonnet, as you may know, is classically employed as a poetic device for men to express their love of women. But that's not the case here, at least not for the first 127 sonnets in this collection. These are the young man sonnets, and the young man sonnets are written for, well, a young man. Although if you watched our Introduction to William Shakespeare's Sonnets, you might remember that it's not entirely clear that all of these poems are written for a young man. The way that we read them today stems from the fact that they were published in this specific order in the quarto of 1609, and this is a publication that William Shakespeare took no part in. Nevertheless, speaking of quarto 1 and its relationship to the rose metaphor, as it happens, the quarto version both capitalizes and italicizes the word rose wherever it appears. You can see that here in the facsimile reproduction of the original printing. Look at line 2. The word rose, if it's capitalized, would be a proper noun, and therefore meant to perhaps signify a specific individual. Many critics have run with this interpretation, but Stephen Booth, who I tend to agree with on most things when it comes to William Shakespeare's sonnets, he argues that this is merely a typesetter's whim. In fact, in most of the modern editions that I'm familiar with, the word rose is not capitalized and it's not italicized. Either way, though, it might make for an interesting essay topic should you ever be asked to write about these poems. The third interesting thing about the rose metaphor is that it has the ability to both signify mortality and immortality. Very important themes that are going to run through the entirety of this collection. In the first quatrain, the speaker tells the young man that if he reproduces, his beauty might never die. The obvious implication here is that if he does not reproduce, then he will die. But how is this immortality to be achieved? Certainly no individual rose can live forever. Well, immortality is achieved through reproduction. While each individual rose withers and dies, it leaves behind it new buds on the rose bush that reproduce its own beauty. This metaphorical life cycle we can actually see reproduced in the poem itself, in that the word rose appears in the first quatrain and the word bud appears in the final quatrain. There are other metaphors in this sonnet, but what I'd like to do now is draw your attention to what we might call a muted metaphor. And that muted metaphor is the metaphor of commerce. I say muted because the metaphors of a commercial nature in this sonnet are not truly made explicit, but in future sonnets in this cycle, they will be made explicit, very explicit. And the speaker will often use these commercial metaphors or business metaphors as a vehicle to express ideas of romantic love, which is kind of, but not exactly, what he's doing in this sonnet. In this sonnet, the most explicit commercial metaphor is found in the second quatrain in line 5, when the speaker claims that the young man is contracted to his own bright eyes. A contract, of course, is a binding legal document often executed in business deals. And we find business-related language throughout this poem, supporting the fact that the speaker is interested in using commercial metaphor to explore themes of love. The word tender, for example, appears twice in this poem. Now, tender can mean either young or gentle or easily chewed or sensitive to the touch. But it can also be understood as legal tender, that is, cash or coin acceptable for the settlement of debt. Finally, I'd also argue that in the third quatrain's insistence that the young man is a churl and a niggard because he's choosing unwisely to save his beauty, his capital, rather than wisely invest it, that this is another commercial metaphor of sorts. At any rate, as we move forward through Shakespeare's sonnets, always be on the lookout for commercial or business metaphor. This could be a very interesting essay topic for you. Potential essay topics could include comparing and contrasting Shakespeare's use of commercial metaphor. Is Shakespeare saying that love is always transactional, like in a business deal? Or is he saying that, like love, market interaction and productive commercial wealth breeds creativity and abundance? Aside from metaphor, Shakespeare is also a master of the pun. A pun is the use of a word so as to suggest two or more of its meanings, often but not always in a humorous fashion. There are two prime examples of puns in this sonnet. For the first, we'll go back to the word contracted, found in the second quatrain, line 5. Here are the pertinent lines from that quatrain. But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel. Here, contracted can mean, as we discussed previously, that the young man is contracted to his own bright eyes. That is, he is legally bound to his own bright eyes. He's, in other words, obsessed with his own bright eyes. But this word we're discussing, contract, can mean something else if you place the stress on it differently, if the word becomes contract rather than contract. To contract means to be made smaller in size, scope, or range. So here, the young man, according to the speaker, is being made smaller in size by not reproducing. The young man is growing smaller like a burning candle, burning out on his own self-substantial fuel. The other pun I think you should pay attention to in this sonnet is found in the word content, which is in the third quatrain, line 11. Here the speaker says to the young man, "Within thine own bud, buryest thy content." The word content, like the word contract, assumes simultaneously two different meanings depending on where you place the stress on the syllables. So we have either the word content or content. The first meaning is content. By refusing to reproduce, the young man is burying his content, that which is contained within him, his genetics, his physical content. And by not doing so, by not reproducing that is, the young man is also denying himself the happiness, the contentedness, the joyful experience of fatherhood, his content. The young man, according to the speaker, will not be content unless he shares his content. Well, I hope, viewer, that you're content with this content concerning Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 1. As always, we're going to wrap up with some comprehension questions in the A+ Extra Credit Corner. I encourage you to answer these questions in the comments below. In addition, please feel free to ask me any question you may have about Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 1. And with that, let's get to the questions. Number 1. Who are the characters in this poem? Number 2. What is Sonnet No. 1 about as a whole? Number 3. Is Sonnet No. 1 a young man sonnet or a dark lady sonnet? Number 4. What is a metaphor? Number 5. Can you identify another metaphor that's not covered in this video? What does it mean? And number 6. What is a pun? This concludes our lesson on Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 1. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. Also consider sharing it with friends, fellow students, and your English teacher. If you have any questions about this video or other questions about your English language arts studies in school, please don't hesitate to ask down in the comments. I'm available, and I'll do my very best to offer high-quality answers to anything you might want to know. Remember that ELA Plus is a free, regularly updated supplemental guide to the English language arts. Subscribe to learn more. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.